On March 15, 1943, at 25,000 feet above the German countryside, Headman Werner Schröer, one of the Luftwaffe's most lethal fighter aces, prepared to intercept an incoming American bomber formation. As he climbed, he spotted a new type of escort, massive radial engine fighters that defied everything he knew about aerial combat. What happened next would shatter his confidence and change the rules of air warfare over the Rye forever. Schröer adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the sky. There were 6 P-47 Thunderbolts flying in a loose finger-four formation. Their massive radial engines were clearly visible even from a distance. The first thing that struck Schröer was their size. The P-47 was enormous, nearly twice the weight of his Bf-109. It looked more like a small bomber than a fighter. In the Luftwaffe, they had heard rumors about this new American fighter but dismissed it as Allied propaganda. After all, how could something so heavy possibly be effective in combat? Schröer had studied every Allied aircraft, knowing their weaknesses, blind spots, and limitations. But about this American behemoth, German intelligence had provided almost nothing useful. He keyed his radio, "All aircraft, prepare to engage. Standard tactics. Attack from above and behind." His formation of 4 Bf-109s rolled into attack position. Schröer had done this hundreds of times before. Altitude advantage, speed advantage, surprise. The formula had worked against every enemy he had faced. He pushed the stick forward, diving toward the nearest P-47. His A-speed climbed quickly, 400 kilometers per hour, 450, 500. The distance closed fast. At 400 meters, he lined up his gun sight on the massive American fighter. The pilot seemed unaware, flying straight and level. This would be easy. Schröer's finger tightened on the trigger. His 20mm cannon roared to life, joined by his two 13mm machine guns. Tracers arced through the air, striking the P-47's fuselage and wing roots. Bright flashes indicated direct hits. Any other fighter would have been torn apart. But the P-47 didn't explode. It didn't even seem to notice. The American fighter simply continued on its flight, as if Schröer's cannon fire was nothing more than raindrops. Then, with terrifying speed for such a large aircraft, the P-47 snapped to the left and climbed. Schröer's veteran instinct screamed danger. He broke right, pulling hard on the stick. The Bf-109 responded instantly, its lightweight frame allowing a tight turn. But when Schröer looked back, his blood froze. The P-47 hadn't fallen away. It was following him and closing the distance. This was wrong. Everything Schröer knew about fighter combat said a heavier aircraft couldn't follow a lighter one in a turn. The laws of physics were absolute. Yet here was this American monster not only keeping up, but gaining on him. His altimeter unwound rapidly. 24,000 feet, 23,000, 22,000. Schröer tried every trick he knew. Barrel rolls, split-S maneuvers, scissors. The Bf-109 was one of the most agile fighters in the world, but the P-47 stayed with him. Worse still, at this altitude, above 20,000 feet, the American fighter seemed to accelerate. Its engine was pulling maximum power while his Daimler-Benz engine struggled for air. Then, he heard it, a sound like tearing canvas, amplified 1,000 times. 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, all firing at once. Schröer's Bf-109 shuddered as heavy slugs tore through his left wing. Red lights flashed on his instrument panel. Coolant temperature spiking, oil pressure dropping. One burst. Just one burst from the P-47, and his fighter was crippled. Schröer dove desperately, trading altitude for speed. The P-47 followed effortlessly. At 15,000 feet, he knew he was in trouble, but the relentless pursuit of the American fighter made it clear that the battle was already lost. Schröer's engine began to seize. White smoke poured from his cowling, and he had maybe 2 minutes before total engine failure. Schröer's years of combat experience kicked in. He throttled back, trying to nurse the dying engine. Behind him, the P-47 closed at 200 meters. The American pilot could have finished him off easily, but instead, he pulled alongside, matching Schröer's speed. For a brief moment, the two pilots made eye contact across the void. The American was young, maybe 22 years old. He didn't look triumphant or aggressive. He looked professional, almost bored. This terrified Schröer more than the guns aimed at him. To this American pilot, shooting down a Luftwaffe ace with 114 victories was just another day on the job. The P-47 waggled its wings once, then pulled up and away, climbing back to altitude to rejoin the bomber escort. Schröer watched it go, his crippled Bf-109 barely maintaining level flight. The message was clear. You're not worth the ammunition. We have bigger targets. Schröer managed to glide his damaged fighter to a small Luftwaffe airfield near Kassel. As the ground crew rushed to help him from the cockpit, he looked at the damage. 23 holes in his left wing, 5 in the fuselage. His coolant tank was shredded, and his oil lines had been severed. That night, Schröer sat in the officer's mess, hands still trembling. His wingman hadn't returned, nor had the other 2 pilots in his formation. 3 experienced pilots gone, shot down by the P-47s in less than 10 minutes. The squadron commander wanted a detailed report. Schröer described the encounter, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. The P-47's incredible durability, its speed at altitude, the devastating firepower, and the way it had simply absorbed his cannon fire and kept flying. The commander listened, his face growing darker with each detail. Hauptmann, you're telling me that a single American fighter outperformed your entire formation. Schröer nodded slowly. So, it wasn't just better. It was from a different world. That aircraft represents a level of engineering and industrial capacity we cannot match. The commander's response was sharp. That's defeatist talk, Hauptmann. German fighters are superior. You've proven that with 114 victories. But Schröer shook his head. Those victories were against aircraft we understood. The P-47 changes everything. In the weeks that followed, Schröer became obsessed with understanding his enemy. He requested every scrap of intelligence on the P-47 Thunderbolt. What he learned was even more terrifying than the combat itself. The P-47 was powered by Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower. For comparison, his Bf-109's Daimler-Benz engine produced only 1,475 horsepower at its peak. But raw power wasn't the whole story. The P-47 had something German engineers had tried and failed to perfect, a fully functional turbo-supercharged system. This allowed the massive radial engine to maintain full power at high altitudes where German fighters were struggling. The intelligence reports revealed that at 25,000 feet, where Schröer had encountered the P-47, the American fighter was actually hitting its performance peak. Fast, powerful, and completely dominant in the high-altitude realm where German fighters had to operate to intercept bomber formations. But what haunted Schröer most was the P-47's durability. The aircraft had absorbed multiple 20mm cannon hits and kept fighting. He learned why. The aircraft had extensive armor plating, a thick armored windscreen, and, most importantly, the massive radial engine acted as a shield. Unlike his liquid-cooled inline engine, the P-47's radial engine had no vulnerable coolant system. Schröer requested a meeting with Luftwaffe technical intelligence. In a secure briefing room, an engineer began to explain what made the P-47 such a formidable enemy. He was shown photographs of a captured P-47. "We've examined it thoroughly," the engineer said. "The engineering is extraordinary, but what's truly shocking is this." He slid a production report across the table. American factories are producing P-47s at a rate of over 500 per month. By next year, they project 800 per month from a single factory complex. Schröer stated the numbers. That's impossible. We produce maybe 300 to 400 single-engine fighters per month total, across all types. The engineer nodded grimly. It gets worse. The R2800 engine isn't just used in the P-47. It powers multiple American aircraft types. The total projected production of this single-engine model will exceed 125,000 units during the war. The number hit Schröer like a physical blow. Germany's entire aircraft engine production across all types during the entire war would be roughly 250,000 units, most of them significantly less powerful. The Americans were building more of a single advanced engine model than Germany could produce in total engines. The disparity wasn't just large, it was incomprehensible. Schröer wrote a detailed report for Luftwaffe High Command, outlining the P-47's technical superiority, the production numbers, and his tactical recommendations: avoid high-altitude engagement with P-47s, use hit-and-run tactics only, but continued attrition would result in unsustainable losses. The report was forwarded to Berlin. Weeks passed with no response. Finally, through informal channels, Schröer learned that his report had been dismissed as overly pessimistic and potentially defeatist. One staff officer reportedly said, "This pilot has been demoralized by enemy propaganda. The P-47 is crude American engineering, inferior to our designs." Schröer wasn't surprised. He'd seen this pattern throughout the war. Intelligence that contradicted Nazi ideology was always rejected, regardless of its accuracy. The idea of German racial and cultural superiority was meant to overcome any material disadvantage. Willpower and determination mattered more than industrial capacity. But Schröer knew the truth, deep in his gut. From the moment the P-47 absorbed his cannon fire and kept flying, he knew that Germany wasn't losing a war of soldiers or tactics. They were losing a war of factories, and no amount of skill or courage could overcome that. In the months following his encounter, Schröer watched his predictions come true. P-47s appeared in increasing numbers over Europe. German fighter losses mounted steadily. Experienced pilots were shot down and not replaced. The young replacements arriving at his squadron had maybe 30 hours of flight training compared to the hundreds of hours he had received. The tactical recommendations he'd made, avoiding high-altitude engagements and using hit-and-run tactics, were slowly adopted by surviving pilots. But by then, it was too late. The Americans had achieved their superiority through sheer weight of numbers and technical advantage. German fighters were forced to pick their battles carefully, avoiding fights they couldn't win. Schröer flew his last combat mission in October 1943. By then, American fighter escorts had made daylight bomber interception nearly suicidal. He was transferred to a training unit, tasked with preparing the next generation of German pilots. It was a bitter assignment. He was teaching young men to fly aircraft that were outmatched, with tactics that barely work against an enemy with overwhelming superiority. One evening, a young lieutenant approached him after a training session. "Herman, is it true you shot down 114 enemy aircraft?" Schröer nodded slowly. Then the lieutenant asked, "Then we can still win, can't we?" "Win? Yes. German pilots are the best in the world," Schröer replied. He looked at the eager young face before him and felt a wave of sadness. "Listen carefully," Schröer said. "Those 114 victories came against aircraft and pilots we understood. We fought enemies who were brave, but whose nations couldn't replace their losses as quickly as we could inflict them. That war is over." The young pilot's face fell. "But we're still fighting." "No," Schröer said quietly. "We're dying. There's a difference. The Americans aren't just sending better pilots or better aircraft. They are sending a level of industrial power that makes everything we do meaningless. For every P-47 we shoot down, 10 more cross the Atlantic. For every pilot they lose, 20 more complete training." He walked to a window overlooking the airfield, where a handful of Bf-109 sat, many with visible damage and makeshift repairs. "You asked if German pilots are the best in the world. Maybe we are. Maybe we're the most skilled, the most experienced, the bravest. It doesn't matter. We're fighting an enemy that doesn't need to be better. They just need to be everywhere, all the time, with aircraft that won't die when we shoot them." The lieutenant stood silently, processing Schröer's words. Finally, he asked, "When did you know we'd lost?" Schröer thought back to that day in March, at 25,000 feet, watching the P-47 absorb his cannon fire and keep flying. "The moment I couldn't kill one of them, and realized there were thousands more where it came from." After the war, when production figures were declassified, Schröer's estimates were proven conservative. He had actually underestimated American capacity. Total American aircraft production from 1940 to 1945 totaled over 300,000 aircraft. In the same period, Germany produced approximately 94,000. The United States produced over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts alone, more than Germany's production of Bf-109s and Fw-190s combined throughout the entire war. The R-2800 engine that powered the P-47 Schröer encountered, over 125,000 were built, not just by Pratt & Whitney, but by Ford Chevrolet, and other automotive companies converted to war production. The industrial mobilization that produced these numbers was unprecedented in human history. The quality remained consistently high throughout the war. Late-war American aircraft showed no signs of declining standards, no shortcuts, no compromises forced by material shortages. German aircraft, in contrast, showed increasing signs of resource constraints, lower-grade materials, simplified construction, and quality control issues. The war Schröer had fought in wasn't won or lost in the skies over Germany. It was decided in the factories of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the oil fields of Texas. Schröer survived the war and lived until 1985. In interviews, he rarely spoke about his 114 victories. Instead, he talked about the day he encountered the P-47 Thunderbolt. "That was the day I understood we'd already lost," he said. "Not because American pilots were better, they weren't. Not because American tactics were superior, they weren't. But because they had built a machine that our best efforts couldn't stop." He described the feeling of pumping 20mm cannon shells into the P-47 and watching it continue flying. It wasn't like fighting another pilot. It was like fighting a concept. The concept that enough industrial power could overcome any amount of skill or courage, and we had no answer for it. Other German aces shared similar experiences. Adolf Göhlen encountered P-47s and immediately recognized their superiority at high altitudes. Göhlen described them as flying tanks that couldn't be stopped. Johannes Steinhoff called the P-47 Thunderbolt the end of the Luftwaffe's dominance. Each experienced the same moment of realization Schröer had. They were fighting a war they could not win. The P-47 Thunderbolt would go on to become one of the most successful fighters of World War II, destroying thousands of German aircraft in air-to-air combat. It devastated ground targets during the advance through Europe and helped secure the air superiority that made Germany's defeat inevitable. It all began with engineers in America building something the Germans couldn't match. For Werner Schröer, the war effectively ended on March 15, 1943, the day he encountered the P-47 Thunderbolt. He would continue flying for months after that, but with the understanding that every mission merely delayed the inevitable rather than altering the outcome. The massive American fighter had taught him a lesson more brutal than any combat loss. Modern warfare wasn't decided by the bravest soldiers or the most skilled pilots. It was decided by factories, resource extraction, industrial capacity, and the ability to produce weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. Germany had built an ideology based on the belief that racial and cultural superiority could overcome material disadvantage. The P-47 proved them catastrophically wrong. Schröer's encounter with the P-47 was repeated thousands of times across the skies of Europe. German pilots, many of them aces with dozens or even hundreds of victories, found themselves outmatched not by superior skill, but by superior machinery produced in quantities they couldn't comprehend. The Luftwaffe defeat wasn't a failure of courage or tactics. It was a failure to understand the nature of industrial warfare. If you find these deep dives into the personal moments that changed history compelling, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit the notification bell. These stories of individual realization in the face of overwhelming odds deserve to be remembered. In the end, Werner Schröer's story isn't just about one German pilot encountering one American fighter. It's about the moment when skill and experience collided with industrial reality and lost.